Right, welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. If you care to sit down, we can get the meeting underway. Right, my name is Toby Dodge. I'm the Consulting Senior Fellow for the Middle East, but that's not very important today. More importantly is my longtime friend and colleague, Emil Hokaim, who joined the IISS's Middle East office in 2010. Before that, he was the political editor of The National, the Emirati newspaper. More importantly, for today's talk, he's written a superb book, Syria's Uprising and the Fracturing of the Levant, which I can recommend heartily, having read it quite a few times. The title of the talk today is Syria After Geneva, Fragmentation and Escalation. Emil says he'll talk for about 20 to 25 minutes and then we'll open up for discussion. We have an hour, so we'll bring the meeting to a close at 2 o'clock. Without further ado, Emil.
Thank you, Toby. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be back in London. I was hoping to that my next lecture in Syria, talk after the launch of the book, would be a more optimistic one. I have to sadly report that my own analysis leads me to believe that this is only going to get worse. Perhaps not in terms of numbers and casualties, because dynamics of civil wars mean that very often the people who could get killed actually have moved out before, because there is a kind of either voluntary or forced cleansing, departures, leaving from region, etc. So today, it's not just the level of violence that we have to look at. It's actually how the whole battlefield, how the ground is changing inside Syria. And I think we've entered that period right now where things are clarifying in terms of territorial control, in terms of way different actors control whatever territory they control, how they present themselves to the local population, to regional actors, to international actors. I'm going to try to make sense of this in this presentation. But let me start by making two important analytical points. The first one is that we have to be careful about the grand narratives we impose on the Syrian conflict. From mid-2012 to early 2013, there was the sense that the rebels were winning, that the regime was collapsing, that there was an inevitability. And people would actually identify several key events to support that narrative. The bombing in the National Security Headquarters in July 2012 in Damascus that removed a number of the top security guys in the regime. The rebel campaign in Aleppo, the increasing tightening, the pressure around Damascus, and the fact that the rebels controlled a number of very important neighborhoods in and around Damascus. I remember late 2012, early 2013, many of my colleagues, fellow analysts, etc., just estimating the survival of the regime in a matter of weeks, and that's it. And at the time, I pushed back a lot on this one. But now we have the opposite narrative. And obviously, this didn't work. Now we have the opposite narrative, that the regime is victorious and the rebels are losing because they're fragmenting, etc. So we pick one data point, the defeat in Yabrud. And for the past 2 weeks, it's all about Yabrud, this geographically important area, and I'll get back to this in a second, as an example that the regime has been able is victorious. It's just a matter of time before it debilitates the rebels. Except that in the past 2 weeks, we saw the biggest, most massive pushback by the rebels at the same time in many other areas of the country. We have to be careful about how we identify this. No one is losing, no one is winning. And the problem is that by over-interpreting military setbacks or victories by either sides, we only make it, we create a more simple narratives for ourselves as analysts, as observers, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the real dynamics on the ground. Because you have a lot of developments that happen below that level. to take you back to the first narrative, is that during that period was where the regime was pulling back, was really under pressure, mid-2012, early 2013, it was also reorganizing militarily. It was rethinking its strategy and its tactics. And it adapted, and it adapted pretty well to this. Now the question is, are the rebels engaged in a similar exercise? And when I say the rebels, I emphasize the S at the end of rebels. I understand, and I get to this in a second. It is a very fragmented, very complex rebel environment. The second point is analytical that I want to make is that we have to fight the temptation, the analytical laziness, to describe the Syrian conflict as primarily a proxy war. It's convenient. The proxy framework leads us to make some analytical conclusions. First, it's easier to advocate diplomacy if you believe it's a proxy conflict first and foremost, because if only Iran and Saudi Arabia can come together and facilitate and bring their own guys to the table, then things would be fine. So that there's this element. It takes away agency from the Syrians themselves. It turns them into all poor victims, or they're all bad. I mean, you know, you have those two extremes. In fact, in Syria, local and transnational, and when I say transnational, I say non-state dynamics, shape the conflict more than the regional competition. The regional competition exacerbates and it manipulates at time those dynamics. And of course, it would be much better if Saudi and Iran could figure out a way not to exacerbate those tensions, you know, can get settlement, etc. But it's dangerous to ignore the fact that you have self-sustaining dynamics that have emerged in Syria that are in a way independent from the desire of the major states in the region that are at odds and are actually looking for ways to influence the outcome in Syria. What we saw in the past 3 years, and especially in the past year and a half, 2 years, is the emergence of local and transnational actors with their own legitimacy, their own narratives, their own sources of funding, etc. And those self-sustaining dynamics are as follows. The first one is that you have the development of a real war economy. It's not both the regime and the actors opposing the regime, and there's a variety of this, have adapted to a new way of operating, of extracting resources from the population, from the checkpoints they control, the border points they control, from the oil fields they control, etc. At times, the regime and rebel actors cooperate for limited reasons. We see this on oil, but not only oil. There was this episode where rebels controlled places, fields of wheat, but they didn't control the mills. So there was an exchange, actually. Each of them took cuts, and the rest was distributed, etc. I mean, which is normal. I mean, what's happening in Syria today is it's not a hard partition, it's a self-partition, where actors operate in relatively small areas that are not totally self-sustaining, in the sense that they still have to trade, they still have to allow trade and people and goods, etc., to cross their territory, make it to others, etc. So the war economy is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of this, because, of course, it leads to development of criminality, parasitic behavior by a number of actors, rebels, but not only rebels. The regime itself, and I'll get to this today, is a collection of militias that also depends on prying on the local population. I'll give more. The other aspect here is local mobilization. At this point, there is fear across Syria among all communities. Whether it's irrational or rational, is up for discussion in some areas or not. But people come together largely because of the perceived need for self-defense in many places. They don't need the regime or the rebels to tell them organize to organize. They do it almost instinctively. And this is a problematic issue in the sense that you have, I mean, I never thought that I would have to spend time studying the tiny Assyrian population in Syria, but it turns out that they've organized and they operate in parallel with the Kurds and others. And I mean, and you're talking about a tiny community that sees itself in danger from both the regime side and the rebel side, and have picked to work with Kurds and others precisely because of this. Not that they have a very good historical relationship with the Kurds. I mean, there were lots of tensions, and you know, in Iraq as an example, and other places. But they have their own narrative. They have their own perception of how to go about ensuring their own survival. Another element here about the self-sustaining dynamics is that the small and light weaponry you need to control a specific area is available. I mean, you know, there's no problem of supply of small and light weaponry. The problem with the proxy war framework is that it leads us to believe that you have massive quantities of weapons coming at all times and feeding the conflict, and if only you could cut this out, things would be fine. Well, no, actually, the quantity of weaponry that went in was very significant, and as I said, exacerbated things, etc. But still, you know, most of the weapons are acquired from arsenals that have been broken into, from black market, etc. The game-changing weaponry is the one that comes from outside, but it doesn't come in quantity and in sustainable ways to be enough quantities and sustainable manners to actually have a decisive impact on the battlefield, and I'll get to that. So those elements are here, and then you have the funding element. And when it comes to funding, a number of actors have access to you know, non-state, call it individual funding from a number of Gulf states, but not only. There's also mobilization in Shia communities in Iraq and the Gulf, etc., to support the various Shia militias fighting in Syria. Of course, the biggest chunk for the moment still comes from you know, Gulf individuals towards these people, and those individuals are not necessarily responsive to you know, direction from the state. It would be a big mistake to think that you know, the Saudi government or any other government says contribute, don't contribute, and people behave as such. People are, you know, they've bought into not only a Syria-centered, but a regional narrative in which Syria is the key battlefield for the future of the Levant. So whether the Saudi government thinks it's good or bad, and I happen to think that the Saudis are actually extremely careful at that level, contrary to, you know, the dominant idea, it doesn't necessarily impact individual behavior. Individual behavior can be shaped by legislation in the Gulf, by the preferences of these countries, but it is not the most decisive factor in explaining this. The point here is that Assad here is no proxy to anyone. He would be fighting even if the Iranians were not fully on his side. Perhaps not him as a person, but the asabiya factor, the kinship, the group solidarity factor ensures that, you know, that these Assad and people alike in the regime structure see themselves, I mean, as forced to do this. They're stuck in this conflict. The various rebel groups are not necessarily proxies, and I'll get to this in a second, and actually try to shatter some preconceptions about this. I also have a problem with the proxy characterization, because if you assume that Syria is a proxy battlefield between Iran and Saudi Arabia, then my question to you is, why is it a proxy war if there are uniformed Iranian soldiers fighting on Syrian territory? It's not proxy. There is a direct involvement. So let's get the definition part right as well. What we have here is a complex set of evolving opportunistic relationships. No group in Syria today, especially on the rebel side, again, I'll get to this in a second, is a Qatari proxy or a Saudi one. Yes, they do have privileged relationships at times, etc., but they change. They change a lot, and I'll explain. The other thing, and this is an example I stress, when Jaish al-Islam, this group that is mostly based in and around Damascus and the south, emerged as, it started as Liwa al-Islam, headed by Zahan Aloush, and then it merged with other groups in September of 2013 and became Jaish al-Islam, and then in November 2013 became part of the Islamic Front. Jaish al-Islam is described by many people as a Saudi proxy, their main go-to person, because the father of Zahan Aloush is a Syrian Salafi preacher who lived in Saudi Arabia for a very long time. So automatically, they're a tool of Saudi foreign policy. Except that actually Zahan Aloush, his father, was actually close to the Sahwa, the quasi-Muslim brotherhood in Saudi Arabia that is actually at odds with the Saudi political and clerical establishment. And in fact, there were tensions between the two, and between Zahan Aloush and his crowd, that crowd, and the Saudis, and they've been trying very hard to smooth that relationship. And I'm not saying that there's been no funding. I actually believe that there has been funding, etc. But the way we characterize those relationships needs to be more cautious than we do. And finally, I don't think that we can characterize. Before this, at the same time, Syrian actors, and especially rebel actors, of course, they cater to Gulf concerns and priorities, etc. Ahmad Jarba, the head of the Syrian National Coalition, just a few days ago gave an interview to, I think it was Al Hayat, in which he says, and that was the headline, the plastered headline, "We're fighting a war with Iran and Hezbollah on behalf of all Arabs." So, of course, you read this and you say, well, he's either a proxy or he is actually trying to suck up to, his potential funders. And this is what any wily political actor would do. Now, he may not achieve his goal to actually mobilize all Arabs and have them espouse that narrative and live up to what he's saying they should do. But they will do it, and you can find a lot of quotes on Assad's side and so on, describing his eternal alliance with Iran and Hezbollah, etc. But it doesn't mean that those actors don't have some room to maneuver. And finally, whose proxy is ISIS, Daesh, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria? And I think this is a group that has a clear ambitions that sees the Iraqi and Syrian battlefield as merged at this point. We see movement of fighters between the two. The funny thing early on about ISIS is that ISIS was worried, when it was only ISI, so focused on Iraq, was worried that the Syrian battlefield would suck up fighters and attention from the Iraq battlefield on which they were focused. And that's the 2012 period. And so Jabhat al-Nusra was the Syrian actor, and then they thought, you know what? No, we can merge those battlefields. We don't have to accept that border, whatever it is. It makes sense, if you can operate from Raqqa to Fallujah, move fighters, use resources, extract resources along this, fine by us, and it helps us build this narrative of, in a Islamic state and Islamic caliphate and so on. So their own calculation, ISIS, have evolved over time, and that's why I wonder, can anyone tell me which of these major groups can be characterized as a proxy? I'm not. Okay, so the title of the talk is After Geneva, essentially. And let's look very quickly at the diplomacy on Geneva. It's essentially in the ICU, and I doubt that the patient will be brought out of that room anytime soon. Let's be honest. Diplomacy was always an illusion and probably a delusion of everyone. It was a way to push away difficult political and other choices, give the illusion that we're doing something, give the illusion that diplomacy was necessary to create humanitarian openings inside Syria, etc. And in fact, the many premises of diplomacy have been exposed as fallacious at this point. The main one was the main assumptions were all Russia-centered. That Russia was serious about diplomacy for reasons that went beyond Assad himself. That Russia didn't fundamentally care about Assad, that it had reasons of interest and standing that went beyond this issue. The second premise is that Russia was not only willing but also able to move Assad on the political front. This is an untested assumption, and this is one that we accept, but I actually question that. I mean, the real differential here, the one thing to keep in mind is that Russian leverage over Assad is greater than US leverage over rebel actors. It's that differential that explains the diplomacy, but it doesn't mean that the Russian leverage over Assad is decisive, just as the US leverage over the rebels is not decisive. So we have to be careful about understanding the differential rather than the leverage in and of itself. There is another point here, is that the point about the necessity to engage Russia in diplomacy with Syria was that Russia could do a lot more to help Assad unless engaged. So let's engage it. What we missed because of that line of thinking is that Russia was doing enough already to help Assad survive. So yes, it could do a lot more, and no one can dispute that. But it was already doing enough to help him survive, and I'll get to this in a second. And to add to this, the reality is that Russian support for Assad in terms of weapons and so on has increased after the chemical weapons deal. This is something we don't want to face, but this is the reality when you look at, there was a couple of pieces written on this and research and so on, but the delivery of weapons, including UAVs, including spare parts and other things for helicopters, Assad hasn't been able to rebuild his aircraft and so on. He has had some help there, but the real difference is on actually rotary wing capabilities, helicopters. That's because after the chemical weapons deal, Russia increased its leverage. And my concern is that was the quid pro quo to get Assad to relinquish, or at least say that he was relinquishing his chemical weapons. Russia gave him the stuff he actually really needed to fight that on the battlefield. Now, we want to fool ourselves and clap for the chemical weapons deal. I happen to be very critical of that deal, the way it happened. I'm not convinced that it's saying. And more fundamentally than that, I think that we analytically failed to accept that Assad would use chemical weapons in a deniable, small-scale battlefield way, because we were stuck in models of chemical weapons use before. Anyway, this is behind us, but it's important to keep this in mind. The other main actor in Geneva was the US. And the hope, perhaps the assumptions of some, is that the US had a plan B should Geneva fail. We had 2 rounds in Geneva. It's very unlikely that we'll have a third round anytime soon. But it's plainly apparent that the US has no plan B, that actually nothing fundamental has happened because of the failure of Geneva. So yes, John Kerry has invested a lot in this, but there is nothing clear, and I'll get to this so-called Southern push in a second. There's nothing that indicates that there was a shift in US policy, that somehow, because this has failed, they have something else in mind that they could activate quickly. The reality is that, for good or for bad, US-Syria policy today is hostage to US-Iran policy. And I would argue that the Iran factor has been hanging over Syria, the Iran engagement factor, of which I'm supportive, but, and I think is important. But we should be honest with ourselves that this was a key factor in setting Washington's preferences. Now, what's the outcome of Geneva? To be honest, when you look at the two sessions of talks in Geneva, the reality is that I thought that the regime, before it happened, I thought that the regime could make the most out of it. That, because of its relative successes on the battlefield, because of the narrative of takfirism taking over and, growing, etc., that the regime would present itself as a confident, constructive player, etc. But in fact, when you look at the tone and theatrics of the Syrian official delegations in Geneva, they shot themselves in both feet at the same time. I mean, it was farcical in a way. And they could have achieved, I think, tactical gains. They could have actually presented themselves as cooperative and constructive, especially on the counterterrorism front. And this is what I expected from them, that they would go and turn to all these countries around the table and say, look, at the end of the day, the real strategic threat from you are all these jihadis, where they're, from your own countries or others that will, go back to Saudi or France or the UK or other countries. And it's the rebels who helped create that situation. We can help you. We can offer information about Western hostages in Syria, about Western jihadis, etc. But the delegation was never able to formulate a clear message, a clear offer. And that's because I think it's very specific historical mindset. Like, those elements were there, except that they were never put on the table in a rational, clear, manipulative way as well. I mean, let's be honest on this one. In comparison, and perhaps because we had low expectations of the opposition delegation, it actually proved it behaved pretty well. It was pretty competent. They put papers on the table. They avoided hyperbolic language. They were actually pretty sharp in front of the media in talk. I mean, Ban Ki-moon scolded Walid Ma'allim, but not Ahmed Jarba. You see all these things. And good for the opposition, except that Geneva was fundamentally and remains irrelevant to the key dynamics on the ground. It was entertaining for a couple of weeks. We all hoped something else would happen, but it wasn't. And it wasn't relevant on a very important dimension, which is the humanitarian tragedy inside Syria. The thinking before was that you needed to split the humanitarian track from the political one. So Valerie Amos and other senior UN officials had their own track discussing on the side, trying to engage the Iranians, others into this, saying, it's just this massive thing. In Geneva, what happened under Brahimi is an attempt to link the two, to say, okay, instead of going for a political transition, we're really going to aim for confidence-building measures inside Syria. So local deals, perhaps in Homs, perhaps in Damascus, etc., some, very localized measures, and we're going to see if we can get more humanitarian access in some places and so on. And this was on the table. And then you had the episode in Homs and in Yarmouk as well, which is not directly linked to that thing. Yarmouk is a Palestinian camp where UNRWA was the lead. In Homs, it was UNHCR and so on, which came to the old neighborhoods of Damascus. This essentially happened. But the regime was unable to deliver there, and unwilling as well. Okay, let me move quickly to the regime strategy. I know we shouldn't do that, but I want to brag for a second. In early 2013, I wrote a piece actually saying that Assad had a political horizon, the 2014 elections, and that the regime had reorganized with that political horizon, and that it was actually, it had the means and it had the strategy to work in that direction. And essentially this has happened. Today what we see is the regime putting on a big show, and I suspect the regime will organize those presidential elections as a show of legitimacy. The regime looks good in comparison to other actors. And this is what it always wanted. The regime was never wanted to look good. It doesn't care, and it doesn't care largely because its own allies don't care. Whereas the rebels need to look good because their allies tell them, unless you look good, you're not going to get any support. You may not get it at all anyway. But that's a different story. So for the regime, the point was never to look good. It was to look good in comparison, to look efficient, able to mobilize on the ground, etc. And the presidential election is going to be an important symbolic term and show legitimacy of order, of cohesion, etc. What happened since 2013 is what I described before, a military strategy aiming to meet this objective. So the regime pushed where it mattered. The regime, late 2012, understood that it could not take the whole country. It made no sense. It didn't have the resources, etc. So you have to identify the areas that matter for regime survival. And it pushed in those places. It doesn't mean that it's not fighting in other places, like Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor, actually, when you look at it, is not that important from a regime perspective. But what it does, it forces the rebels to dedicate forces to that area, which means that the regime can operate in areas that matter more to it. The regime is not after conquering population or bringing back, it's about conquering territory. And in fact, if people leave, even the better. You know, the regime doesn't want all these IDPs and refugees. It's better if they move, they leave, to other countries, etc. And if they want to come back, let them crawl back. It's not hearts and minds thing. I mean, I hear some people talk about a counterinsurgency strategy. Well, counterinsurgency is also about protecting, about delivering goods, etc. The regime cannot afford to waste resources on this waste. So essentially what has happened is the destruction of residential areas. What happens when you do that is that you shift the burden of taking care of those civilians onto rebel shoulders who already have very limited resources. Then there is anger at those rebels for actually inviting rebels, and it has actually proven effective. In parallel to that strategy, what you've had is a strategy of local accommodations and ceasefires, especially around Damascus and in Hamas and those places. So you bomb, you starve, etc. Then when people are totally exhausted, you propose a truce that creates rifts among rebels, and we've seen that in a number of places. And you get those accommodations. So it has happened in Barzeh, Ma'adamiyah, a number of, the Wall Street Journal had a great piece on this. And the regime has actually secured the main access from Damascus to Aleppo, to the coastal regions. It is now encircling Aleppo because of all that strategy. Another link point, and I have to conclude soon, but is that in the discourse often on Syria, we treat the humanitarian tragedy as the deplorable outcome of the fighting instead of a deliberate strategy by the regime. And I really want people to just read the Human Rights Watch report that came out 2 days ago and everything else that human rights and humanitarian organization put out. The tragedy is an objective of the regime because it shifts the burden onto others, it puts pressure on neighboring countries, it debilitates the rebels, etc. My final point here is that we have to be careful not to overplay the regime's recovery. A necessary condition for the regime's survival was its transformation into a collection of militias. The regime today has lost coherence. I'm not saying cohesion, coherence. Because basically the regime would have been unable to fight as a conventional military force, as a state, etc., against those rebels. It had to devise less costly, more flexible, more loyal, more sluggish strategies to make up, to adapt to this shifting battlefield. This it has worked in the short to medium term, but it has a major downside in the sense that it has created local actors with local interests and local calculations. And that comes at the cost of the regime presenting itself as a coherent, cohesive actor, etc. And we see that already. It's becoming more difficult for Assad and his top people to orchestrate all these militias. There is a difference of culture, of objective, of local behavior, etc., between all these groups. Just a couple of examples. In Suwaida in the south, the National Defense Force, which is a pro-regime paramilitary force, which is Jews-heavy, refused to help in some important battles in Daraa and around. In Latakia right now, the Mukawama Syria and the National Defense Force of Hilal al-Assad, who was killed a few days ago in Rif Latakia, behave almost independently from the Syrian army. In Homs, Sakr Rustam, the head of the NDF there, opposed the deal, the humanitarian deal in Homs, and Assad had to send Deep Zaytoun, who's one of his top guys, the head of the GID, to make this thing happen because it was turning into a major embarrassment for him because the pro-regime elements were opposing a regime decision and clearly in front of everyone. Maher Assad, an officer in Maher Assad Force Division, actually stopped smuggling by Rami and Hafiz Makhlouf a couple of weeks ago. So, you have all this behavior happening on the ground, and add to this the fact that you have all these foreign militias, including Hezbollah, including Shia militias, etc., that think of themselves very differently from the regime itself. There is a great YouTube video from an Iraqi Shia militia, and that I promise will be my last comment, that shows fighters dancing with their AK-47s, and the chorus of the thing is that we are not for Bashar, our concern is the Shias. So to orchestrate all that is going to be extremely difficult. In the short term, it's working, don't get me wrong. But in the medium term, the regime is a collection of militias. And it's going to be very difficult, both politically and militarily, to keep some coherence to all that. Let me end here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Emil has been kind enough to leave us with 20 minutes for discussion, so who would like to ask the first question? Yes, you, sir.
Two questions, please. First of all, for how long do you think the West can wait before taking decisive steps to ending this trend? Do you agree with what saying that as long as Barack Obama is in the White House, there will be no major decision to end the Syrian tragedy? Second question, Syria after Ukraine. Do you think that the West is still seeing Russia as a good partner, real partner in solving Syria crisis? This imperial Russia. Thank you.
We'll take a few. Cho.
Thanks, Toby. Emil, I understand what you say. At least I think I understand what you say. It's a stalemate, and it's not two sides. It's many different sides with many different agendas. What I struggle with is what's the end point? Can you see an end point, or do you see different end points in this game?
And yeah, you, sir.
My name is Juan Hamdan. Mr. Emil, do you know how much the Iranian involvement is in Syria? I mean, money-wise. They are funding Hezbollah, the Iraqi Shia militias, and that costs a lot of money, and the Castellan are sending there. But are they also funding the economy of the regime and saving it from collapse? And if yes, how much? Can you give us a number?
Right, so you've got, if you can explain US policy towards Syria, you're a better man than me. And then you've got Syria after Ukraine. Is there an end point, and how much are Iran spending to get there?
Sure. Well, on the Western strategy, if I were to tell you what I really think should happen, Toby here would actually, he doesn't have a hammer, so it's fine. I cannot think. No, look, I think that the White House has, it's a clear decision by the president not to be involved there. It's not hesitancy anymore. It's not that it's a confusing environment. It's not that saying, it's a decision. And the problem is that the avoidance of hard decisions only make it more difficult to come up with a menu of options later. And this is where we are today. If you had asked me in 2012 about what a Western strategy is, a coherent, sustained Western strategy to help the rebels would look like, and who it would benefit, I could have made a convincing case. But I'm going to be honest with you. Today, my instinct, my understanding of the conflict tells me that they should do it. But my case is much weaker than it was 2 years ago. And the problem today is that, so you had this moment in August, September 2013. I thought that there was a case for intervention before the chemical weapons attacks, and these were only the last in a series of chemical attacks. So let's be frank on that one. But you had this opportunity. It's tragic, but you had this opportunity. I think that walking back from this one has made it almost impossible at this point to explore direct intervention. And the point of arming before, the point of those who advocated arming before was precisely to avoid direct military intervention, to say you need to develop partners over time because you have to worry about local governance and have Syrian partners to fight jihadis and etc. over time. I never believed, by the way, that you can arm the rebels to win militarily against Assad. And that's one of the big issues with the rebels, is that they have to understand that whatever is provided to them is not going to be a game changer in the sense that it's going to collapse this thing. Yes, but what it means is that the rebels themselves need to think politically. Not saying that some kind of like amazing rocket or weapon is going to land and make a huge difference on the battlefield. It wasn't going to happen. Today, I don't see clear options besides arming some groups, making sure, and actually what I would recommend from a Western perspective is making sure not to fall for the counterterrorism narrative that is taking shape. That somehow, to fight the jihadis today, you have to somehow engage the Assad regime. My point is that your best counterterrorism strategy, from if you're an American official or a European official or whatever, is precisely to help the rebels because they're the ones who are fighting the jihadis. And they're the ones who have the local intelligence, the legitimacy, etc., to pick up that fight. There are a number of people who disagree with this line, who say, no, you're deluded, you've been deluded thinking the rebels can do anything. You have to engage with Assad because he's the best partner against jihadis. I mean, I'm not going to go through the history of Assad manipulating jihadi groups in the past. I totally reject this argument. But to be honest, I don't see a clear strategy from now on. Syria after Ukraine. Look, Russia was a convenient pretext for the US in particular not to examine the harder choices before. Because you have to placate Russia, because you need Russia on board for a diplomatic process, etc., you cannot push too far. Today, my worry is that the West and others may consider escalating in Syria because of Ukraine, not because of the own merits of the Syrian crisis. Because if it would have been based on the own merits of Syria, they should have done it way before, and politically it would have been very difficult. You don't want Syria to be a proxy, now I'm getting into the proxy thing, but to be a proxy battlefield because America and Russia are competing over Ukraine. It's important to take stock of the reality today that Russia was not going to be a helpful actor in Syria. Now, from Assad's side, it's great. Ukraine is great news. It basically means that the Russians are not going to put pressure on him. They're committed to him. They have no reason to work with the Americans, etc. And if you've read any of the Syrian official media, there is absolute glee at what happened. The question about the stalemate and the endpoint. Look, I think the elements for a decade-long conflict are there. I see a soft partition. I don't see a hard partition happening because the country is economically not viable, logistically, etc. But in endpoint, I don't see it. I see many warlords. Assad being the most powerful. I think Assad in the short to medium term is here to stay. He's going to be the warlord of Damascus and a few other places, the most powerful guy on the land, but essentially a warlord, and many others around. And the question is, can you think about, 5, 10 years down the road, kind of political settlement? And a lot of people say, oh, well, look at the Lebanese case, Ta'if and 1989 and so on. It's an example I hate. Primarily because I'm Lebanese, and I need to remind people that the only reason, although I think Ta'if had its own merits, don't get me wrong, the only reason why Ta'if was successful is precisely because we allowed Syria to become the dominant political and military actor in the country. So, we turned this political settlement, it's like, oh, look, you can do it, and Brahimi did it in 89, and you can recreate all this dance. The decisive element was the decision to give Lebanon to Syria in 1990, and who's going to do it in Syria? Are we? No, of course not. No one is going to send, peacekeepers, and there is not going to be an invading force that can protect this. So let's put aside the Taif example. It's it gives us false hopes. It's not the kind of framework I would look at. The Iranian investment. Look, I would love to be able to quantify it. All I can tell you is. That it is actually massive, and it has been game-changing. Look, it's better to think about Iran's support for Assad in comparison to the Gulf state support for the Gulf state support for the rebels. The Gulf states provide money and weapons. Iran provides money, weapons, expertise, experience, and strategic patience. The reason why Assad and the Iranians are ahead in that game is not just because of the money and the weapons and the line of credit for food and gasoline and all these very important things, don't get me wrong. It's because of these other three elements: expertise, experience, and strategic patience. Who is leading the fight for Iran in Syria? Qasem Soleimani, a guy who fought the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, who fought counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics campaigns in the 90s and then was involved in Afghanistan, checkmated the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan in the previous decade, and now he's in Syria. Can we name someone on the Saudi or Qatari or Turkish side, anyone who has that kind of experience, had that kind of depth? No. So my point is, all things being equal, I mean, you could follow Qasem Soleimani or whomever is, orchestrating the fight on the other side. That is the fundamental point. Now, the point for the Iranians is that, contrary to the Americans, the Iranians are able to enter the nuclear diplomacy and increase an involvement in Syria at the same time. It's not that since the nuclear talks in Geneva, and even before, the Iranians decreased the pressure in Syria because we don't want to risk the talks and whatever. No, they continued at the same level, increased, and so on. It's the Americans who, and others who, always second-guess themselves. It's like, okay, but can we actually work on both tracks at the same time, ratchet up the pressure in Syria while not risking nuclear diplomacy? This is for me, these are the two fundamental dynamics. The way the Iranians are able to I can't say that word. Yes, thank you. He's saying it for me. Between their nuclear diplomacy and their regional involvement, and the fact that they have expertise, experience, and strategic patience in Syria that their regional competitors don't have.
Right. Final round of questions, I suspect. You first, sir.
Thank you. My name is Wael Aliji from the Syrian National Council. Thank you very much. Very informative lecture. Do you see any Israeli factor in the background, first? Second, there are talks about a peacekeeping force. Do you think that the Russians would support such an option? And do you think that this might lead to a Dayton-style resolution, which might in turn lead to an allied state?
Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, Emil, I liked your remarks on Iran and Qasem, but you neglected to talk about Hezbollah, a subject dear to my heart. Can you explain to me what's going on in Lebanon? Pyrrhic victory of Nasrallah, April 25th speech? Or is he doing okay? He's winning, he's turning the battle in Syria and still maintaining blockade on decision-making. In fact, he may even influence the choice of the next president of Lebanon. Is he winning on both sides? And he may also get up front against Israel and go on.
Nadine?
Yes, hi. Thanks, Steve. Brilliant. I wanted to ask you, how sustainable is the North strategy in terms of basically dealing with the fallout? The UK is spending 500 to 600 million a year. I cannot see it continuing for 10 years, and it's about it can increase. So is the default is not sustainable either.
Yes, sir.
In order to have a presidential election as opposed to a referendum in the summer, that implies other candidates. Who do you think those other candidates would be? And do you think the regime wants a multi-candidate election so that it can point to this and say, look, this is an example of us reforming?
Yeah, the lady at the back.
Hi. I wanted to ask quite a speculative question about the really interesting stuff you were saying at the end about the sort of militification of the regime. In the kind of encounters so far where someone's kind of defied the regime, they've ended up sort of being smacked down. But do you see warlords emerging who eventually become more powerful than the regime, who they can't smack down, and possibly even who want to cut deals of their own? I mean, could the warlords on his own side be more threat to Assad than the rebels ultimately?
There you go. Do you want to take those 6?
Sure. First, the Israeli factor. Look, for Israel, that was the crisis in Syria was the uprising, the transformation of the uprising into war and whatever, was deeply problematic in the sense that they had dealt with the most predictable foe they could. I mean, the Assad regime was weak and easy to deter. For decades. You could fly F-16s, destroy a nuclear reactor, come back, and nothing would happen. You could go and kill Mohammed Sleiman, and that was this thing. So for Israel to adapt to this new phase, where it now faces a variety of groups, pro-regime, anti-regime, of very different profiles, risk profiles on the Golan Heights in terms of ideology, that's really problematic. But I don't think that Israel has a preference for Assad to stay, actually, compared to what a lot of people say. They're concerned about how he would go, but they're not necessarily, it's not that they're, once he's been weakened the way he's been weakened, there's no strategic upside to keeping him around. The question for Israel is, can it establish relationships of deterrence with whomever emerges on its southern, the Golan area, on the Golan front? And then, perhaps more importantly, is how do you communicate with Hezbollah, in the future if there is no Assad? But these are scenarios that are pretty far down the road. From an Israeli perspective today, look, chemical weapons are on their way out, so that was one of their concerns. That, in a way, is a net security gain. Although I have to remember everyone, the first official to have, in March 2013, to have talked about use of chemical weapons was the Israeli head of military intelligence, and the Americans were mad at him. I mean, a lot of people thought the Israelis would keep quiet, etc. Actually, I think we make assumptions about what the Israelis want and don't want that are often off on that one. So, and I don't think the Israelis are they're a constraint on the kind of weaponry that would go to, and the way help would go to rebels. So yes, they don't want manpads. And I personally don't think that manpads should be on the battlefield just like that. If you're going to do something like this, you don't give it to rebels left and right. It's going to leak, it's going to be massively problematic, and the day some awful accident happens, it's going to be very detrimental to the rebels. So if you're going to do something like that, you send it with special forces who do it themselves or something. But my concern today is more like, Air Force is no longer the big issue, it's more helicopters, so, can we think about it? So I don't think Israel is as much of a factor as people make it to be. Peacekeeping force, I don't think is a viable option at this point. I mean, we're talking about a massive country. The numbers I see for a peacekeeping force would be massive. Where would they come from? It's way too fragmented. If the Americans couldn't do anything in Iraq with 150,000 people, I don't see how this could happen, and I just don't buy it. So the Russia factor is not really there because I think the option is not viable to start with. Hezbollah, Lebanon. Look, Hezbollah's investment in Syria has been massive. It has been massive since 2012, a bit before in terms of advice and consulting services and things like that. But now it's direct, it's massive, it's decisive in many neighborhoods around Damascus, on the border. And not only that, the Lebanese armed forces are at times working with Hezbollah and the Syrian military. We saw this in Yabrud and other places where it's an anvil strategy and so on, which is very problematic. Has Hezbollah taken a political hit? Yes, but I'm not sure it matters that much. First, I think the Shia community in Lebanon understand that it has taken a massive cost. Car bombs blowing up, it's awful, it's tragic. You have these are terrorist attacks, and they're wrecking Beirut. Essentially, there's a climate of fear. But what it does is that it also validates Hezbollah's narrative, that they're coming after us, etc. So if you want a way to mobilize the community, that's a pretty convenient one. The other thing is that from Hezbollah's perspective, there are politics at play. So the real question is who's worse, a Shia jihadi or Sunni jihadi in Lebanon, on the political, sorry to put it as crudely as this one. And this is the debate that's happening inside the Christian community. Lebanon is a place where you have a triangular game. It's not, Sunnis versus Shias or whatever. And although, I warn people not to fall just for the sectarian reading. I mean, it's more complex than that. And Christians in Lebanon wonder who's worse. And Shia jihadis have the advantage of not sending car bombs in the middle of places. Well, they do. They're. If you believe that a number of people, including lastly Mohammed Shattah and others, were killed because of these guys, which I strongly suspect, they do, but it's not as random. It's much more targeted and so on. So that has another dimension. Look, Hezbollah was already a formidable military force in Lebanon prior to the uprising. I think the kind of skills and experiences developing in Syria make it an even scarier, more potent military actor inside Lebanon. The Israelis worry about this. They basically think, oh, it's good that Hezbollah is bogged down in Syria because it diverts them from the Israeli front. At the same time, they worry that they're bogged down, but they're getting skilled in a way that could be problematic down the road. But it can be also problematic in case of a showdown in Lebanon. And final point on Lebanon is that the influx of refugees, the car bombs, etc., have put the March 14 coalition, and especially Saad Hariri, in a very difficult spot, because it is the car bombs and so on are portrayed as coming from the guys that he supports in Syria. I don't think that's the case, but the narrative is powerful enough. And for him today, the Minister of Interior happens to be a Hariri guy. And the Justice Minister as well. They have to deliver. They have to actually provide some kind of security to Tripoli, to the Bekaa, and so on, while also helping their own constituencies, because Arsal is a Sunni town that's under technically almost a blockade today. Nadim, your point about the non-strategy, yes. I mean, the notion that you can come up with a containment strategy regionally to deal with the humanitarian issue and so on, and that's the only involvement, is a convenient illusion. But the problem is that it requires countries to put billions of dollars. But look, Syria, very sadly, is not an issue that has attracted the empathy and the sympathy of Western and other publics. Governments are putting down money. Individuals are not mobilizing. You know, you talk to charities, Oxfam, and anyone else who deals with refugees. They're saying we can't raise. They really can't raise for Syria. People are tired of this and so on. And so it's a feel-good thing, you know. Oh, we'll address the humanitarian level, and we'll buy into the narrative that they're all sides are bad. So we're, you know, addressing just the suffering of. It's an avoidance strategy. You call it a non-strategy. I think it's an avoidance strategy. It's going to, you know, I mean, Lebanon is on its knees today, and there is no real concerted effort to do anything with this. I mean, yes, there was a meeting in Paris last week with the president and donor countries, and Saudi Arabia is supposed to give $3 billion worth of French weapons to Lebanon, etc. But it's all cosmetic, it's delaying it, and it's not addressing the fundamental issue, which is in Syria, in the battle. Presidential elections, I'm sure there will be useful idiots to run in that one. I mean, I don't put it beyond the regime to come up with a few sham candidates. There is a process to get there. It's an election. I mean, you know, since the new constitution was passed, it's supposedly a more open battlefield, etc. But I don't see, you know, any credible persona, anyone who wants to risk his credibility by playing that game. So, you know, I mean, if Ali Haidar, the Minister of Reconciliation, is counted as an opposition guy, or Qadri Jamil, but he's out of the picture now. He's been pushed out as Deputy Prime Minister. I mean, I don't see who else. And, you know, the regime itself will find someone, but let's agree that it's going to be a sham process. And from a regime perspective, what they'll do is to say, we'll organize it where we can organize it. All the rest, the country, it's chaos and so on. I've asked someone who's close to the regime, are you going to get observers? And yes, you know, the same guys who observed the referendum in Ukraine, you know, and Russians as well. I mean, you know, it's there. The point of this exercise is to show that there is order. There is, you know, it's a show of limited legitimacy, but that's good enough. That's good enough. And Abi, finally, regime warlords. I think this is going to happen, but in the medium term. I don't want to, you know, I've given you examples of places where regime, you know, pro-regime elements are clashing with the regime policy or the military and so on. I don't want you to get out of this room and think that's it, it's dissolving and so on. No, there's still a unity of purpose among these guys. But over time, civil wars have this, you know, tendency to, you know, even erode that kind of purpose. And this is what I see coming. It will happen too late, in a way, to give the upper hand to the opposition and the rebels. And I don't think they ever really had the upper hand on this one. And, you know, take it a bit further. I mean, look at the rebel offensive in Latakia, and, you know, they got to the Mediterranean Sea. We saw the video, etc. I actually think that this could be a recipe for disaster, to be honest. Just as I thought that the rebel campaign in Aleppo was misguided, and you remember we used to talk about this, it was from July 2012 for me, it was like, why are you doing something like that? You're alienating urbanites, you're alienating people, and you don't have a political strategy, you don't have a military strategy, and so on. I can understand the desire to control Syria's largest city. I mean, at the time it was the largest city, no longer, but the rebels are not able. They don't have a military strategy to be spoken of. The southern push is not going to. I mean, is overhyped. I don't think we're going to see some massive push from the south that will make a difference, etc. So the regime warlords are not necessarily in a situation where they have to make fundamental decisions that will lead them away from Assad and whomever is or you know rules in Damascus. It's not going to happen. I think those warlords will be swayed if there is ever a strategy from outside that combines pressure and incentives. That, you know, if you want to be part of a future Syria, come to the table, do all this thing. But, you know, some of those warlords, as I said, are more radical than the regime. and others are actually less. And these are new actors, just as we agonize over identifying rebel groups and warlords, who they are, what their ideology is, etc. I suspect we're going to spend the next 2 years trying to figure out who's who in the new power structure on the regime side.
Well, thank you, Emil. We've reached the end of our allotted time, and as predicted, we were witness to a tour de force, an excellent but incredibly depressing analytical snapshot of where the Syrian conflict is, and I think more impressively where it's going. For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask a question, it's all in this book. So, if you buy this, you get what we've had over an hour in 60,000 words. But it remains us to thank Emil very much.